Did you know that more than 30% of developers say that it can take more than half a day to figure out who owns the code and gather the context necessary? Not only this can be extremely frustrating, but it can also be a productivity killer. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 very easy solutions to implement that can help you find what you need faster, help you create code even faster, and reduce confusion and frustration within your team. And ultimately, this will make you a happier developer because you'll be spending less time on non-core tasks and more time building what really matters: great software. To build a complex software system, there will be several services, applications, and tools involved. And these will be maintained by multiple teams, and it's impossible for anyone to remember everything or know who owns what. And a very simple question such as, what services do we have, becomes nearly impossible to answer. And in that context, it can quickly become a nightmare for you and other developers when trying to get information on a component that you're not very familiar with. So how can you put some order into this chaos? With a software catalog. Think of a software catalog as a central hub where all services, libraries, and resources live. And for each catalog item, you can have a description and define which team or person owns it. It's like having a dictionary of your entire software ecosystem. With a software catalog, you can easily find what you need when you need it. No more digging through multiple tools or asking around to find the right service. Everything is in one place, and it makes it super easy for teams to work together. Imagine that you are onboarding a new team member and they need to know where the payment API is, who owns it, and which other services depend on it. Instead of digging through endless documentation and multiple tools, or even asking around, they can directly go through the software catalog and look it up and get all the information they need in one place in a few seconds. And on top of that, it's actually super easy to build a software catalog. It can be as simple as a markdown file or a YAML file directly in your code repository. It can be an online spreadsheet, or it can even be a Confluence page. But you could also decide to get a bit fancier and use a dedicated tool that offers more features on top of a software catalog, like tracking deployed instances, metrics, versions, and so on. Being able to answer the simple question, what stuff do we have and who owns what, drastically reduces frustration inside an engineering team. It's useful to the new team member to get context, it prevents you from creating stuff you already have, and you can ask questions to the right person to understand what a service does. But would it not be even better if you didn't have to ask questions to understand what a service or an application does? I'm sure you've been there, we've all been there, trying to understand a piece of code with non-existent documentation or outdated documentation. Or maybe you see something and you wonder, why is it done this way? But you don't want to touch it because you're scared of breaking things. It's very frustrating and it's time consuming. But as developers, we are all guilty of not properly documenting what we build. We fear that any documentation we write will never be maintained, and because we struggle to find documentation for other pieces of code, we think that even if we do write documentation, no one will ever find it or read it, so why bother in the first place? So could there be a better approach to documentation that actually makes it easy to maintain and find what we're looking for? I think there is, and it's something the best engineers I've worked with consistently do. It's something that I'm sure you've seen already a million times. Whenever you check out a library on GitHub, 99% of the time, the home page is simply rendered with a README markdown file. And that's an approach called documentation as code. But you don't have to restrict it to the high-level overview in the README. You can create other markdown files in your source code to document different parts of your code base. Markdown is very simple, but it provides all the expressiveness you'll ever need for your documentation. And you can even create diagrams as code using the format like Mermaid. With this approach, documentation is stored right alongside the code it describes. This means that it's much easier to maintain, and it's very easy to access it. No more hunting through separate systems or wondering if what you're reading is still relevant. After working with engineers who consistently add documentation alongside the code, I knew that before even reaching out to ask a question, I could first check the documentation located next to the code, and more often than not, this was enough to unblock me, and that's just an amazing feeling. This approach transforms documentation from an afterthought to a first-class citizen in your codebase, making it just as reviewable and maintainable as the code itself. But here is the really cool part. When you combine documentation as code with a software catalog, people don't even have to open the code to find your documentation. Instead, your documentation is always connected to the right component in your catalog, making it very easy to find and trust. And documentation as code is not just limited to Markdown either. For those of you who receive my newsletter, you've seen that even architecture diagrams can be defined as code. And you have tools to auto-generate documentation from code and code comments. You can generate change logs from Git history, and the list goes on. Knowing what you have with a catalog and documenting what you have as code are great for understanding what you have right now, but what if you need to create something completely new? How many times have you had to create a new application or service and wondered how you were going to deploy it or how to configure the build pipeline? In some cases, you might need to get DevOps and security teams involved. Would it not be great if you could automate the whole thing? So imagine being able to set up a new service by simply filling out a form, pressing a submit button, and everything is done for you. No worries about whether you've configured everything correctly or if you followed the best practices. And that's where a software template come in. These are pre-configured blueprints for creating new services or components. Software templates take care of all of that for you, ensuring consistency across your project and significantly reducing setup time. So not only does this speed the development process, but it also ensures that every service follows the same guideline and standards, which leads to more robust and secure applications across the board. But how do you create an automated software template? Of course, full automation is the goal, but you can take things incrementally. Before you even automate things, you could simply start with a plain text documentation, just laying out the steps, best practices and processes for creating new apps, and that already goes a long way. The next option is to build your own scripts. For example, you could create a shell script that takes some parameters and create, let's say, a React app, add a Docker file, create a new repo, and pushes the newly created app. Basically, putting whatever you would do in your own terminal directly inside a shell script. But you can go one step further and use a dedicated tool such as Backstage, where you have a framework for creating software templates with different steps, descriptions and parameters, etc. And effectively allow developers to create new services from a form. But here is the exciting part. When you combine software catalogs, documentation as code, and software templates, you have the building blocks of a great developer platform. In fact, companies using developer portals with these features have reported a 50% reduction in onboarding time for new developers and 30% increase in productivity for experienced team members. You can watch this next video where you can see how you can bring all these elements together using Backstage, Spotify's open source developer portal framework.